Hi, and welcome to The Missing Middle. I'm Cara Stern.
And I'm Mike Moffat.
In a previous episode, we were talking about property taxes in Toronto, and Mike, you were describing how you felt that there were several different groups of middle class people that we needed to kind of distinguish between to really understand the situation. So let's start there. What are those three different groups?
Yeah, absolutely. So in that Toronto episode, we were really distinguishing between renters and owners, and that's oftentimes how we think about housing market. That you have renters in one bucket and owners in another. But I actually think it's helpful to break them out into three different groups. So we'll keep our renters bucket. But we can look at owner households two ways. So we can look at households that own their house and have no mortgage or very little left on their mortgage. And then another bucket is households where they own the home but they still have a fairly substantial mortgage. And we can break those families down basically a third, a third, a third. A third of families are renters, a third of families are homeowners with big mortgages, and a third are families with no mortgage. And why that distinction matters is that those groups are affected differently, but both by public policy, but also by broader economic phenomenon, whether they be interest rates or inflation or so on. So you can have, three different individuals all making, or three different households all making roughly the same amount of money, but they can be affected very differently in the economy depending on which one of those three buckets they fall under.
So then, how do they kind of differ from each other when you have those different buckets of homeowners in terms of outcomes?
Yeah, so they first of all, I think we need to distinguish what those groups look like. So for the homeowners without a mortgage, they tend to be older, which isn't surprising because they've had 25, 30 years to pay off their mortgage. They tend not to have kids living at home, or at least fewer kids living at home. And many of them are actually not particularly high income because a lot of them might be living off of fixed income. They're retired people. You have a higher proportion of people living alone because the kids have moved out, and oftentimes you have widowers or others. Whereas the ones with sizable mortgages, they tend to skew younger. But when I talk younger, we're looking at 40 to 60 year olds and some folks in their 30s. um, they tend to be dual income earners, more likely to have kids living at home, and so on. But they're affected very differently by policy. So, for instance, higher interest rates tend to help folks without mortgages, right? They don't have a mortgage, they don't have a lot of debt, but what they do have is a lot of savings, which earns interest income. Interest rates go up, those households are made better off. Where on the other hand, you've got households who have sizable mortgages. They get hit hard by higher interest rates, particularly as those mortgages renew, or if they have a variable rate mortgage. So, for instance, I put myself and my family in that bucket. That we got a mortgage in 2018 that renewed last summer, and it renewed at a much higher interest rate, causing our monthly payments to go up over $1,000 a month. Now we could absorb that, but not everybody can. So they're affected differently. They're also affected differently by inflation. So you look at those folks on the fixed income, they're harmed by inflation, right? That inflation tends to erode the value of their savings. That their savings don't go as far when they're out buying groceries or whatever. For the other households, inflation's kind of a mixed bag, because what inflation does is, yes, it erodes the value of their savings, but it also erodes the value of their debt. That debt is now not as high in sort of real inflation adjusted terms. So that's why these distinctions matter, because households are affected very, very differently. And I think from a policy point of view that, the housing crisis became acute for more middle class people when those interest rates started going up, because then it wasn't just renters who would like to be homeowners who were feeling this crisis. Then you got a lot of Gen Xers like me with renewing mortgages who, have been homeowners in my case like 20 years, all of a sudden really feeling this pinch in a way that we haven't in a long, long time.
If you have people in those kinds of those different buckets, how do we then, like when we're talking about middle class, how do we define the middle class? Because it seems like most of the time people try to use income and talk about, it could be people, you take the median income and look at a certain percentage above it, a certain percentage below it, and call that the middle class. But it seems like to me income is not a great way to define middle class.
Yeah, so basically, I would argue that there's no one economic indicator that is useful for defining the middle class, right? Because you could look at income, for instance. Well, you can have a household that has a $3 or $4 million home and is living off of fixed income, and you look at their tax return and go, okay, they only earn $25,000 a year. Well, they're not middle class. They're poor. Or you might have a thing, you have years where Warren Buffett and Bill Gates have negative income, right? But we wouldn't call them poor, right? So you can have all of these income fluctuations. Or you could look at a group like, let's say, somebody in medical school who, is going to have a lifetime where they are, probably beyond middle class, higher than that, but they have no income and their net worth is actually negative, right? But we wouldn't say, oh, okay, well, they are therefore,
We need
worse
to
off
help them.
economically. Yeah, they're worse off economically than a homeless person, a person experiencing or family experiencing homelessness. So there's always these counter examples you can use, and it's why it's challenging to define this thing. So how I would more define it is, who are the folks that over their lifetime are likely to be, somewhere in the, not in the top 10% in their sort of lifetime wealth and income, but not, let's say, in the bottom 30%. That over their lifetime, they're likely to be kind of in the middle, or slightly above the median. But we just have to remember that lifetime income changes. That I've spent parts of my life earning decent income, but I was also a grad student for way too long. And again, if I look at myself back then, I wouldn't say, oh, I wasn't middle class. I mean, I clearly wasn't suffering. I just had a lack of income and a lack of wealth.
Yeah, I think when I talk sometimes to, like when I talk to boomers sometimes who see some of the high salaries in tech industries and fields that a lot of millennials and younger have gone into, and they see these salaries and they're like, okay, well they're doing great. Like, what's the problem here? And I'm like, but like when someone has such a even if they have a rent controlled apartment, if they moved in 15 years ago versus yesterday, their income goes so much farther if they have those lower expenses. So income seems like such a weird way to do it, and it's so interesting that so many people still use that as a method of determining what's middle class and how do we help. How does the government, where should we put money into to help people, right?
Yeah, well, and a lot of those folks probably wouldn't even be considered middle class. They would be considered sort of high income earners. But you go, well, yeah, but all of that sort of income is getting eroded different ways. So I think that's why it's helpful to look at these buckets, because you can look at the renter bucket and you could say, okay, well, they're renter, so they're seeing those incomes erode as rents go up. And yes, being in a rent controlled place helps them keep more of their income, but it also kind of locks them into that place, right? It makes it going, okay, if I ever try to move, what that does is I'm going to be moving into a place where I'm a new tenant, and at least in Ontario, where I'm a new tenant, and the rent control doesn't apply, because the rent is based on the tenant, not the unit. So if I want to keep paying this amount, I could never move. So you get you get the effect of these policies locking people in, and this is why that distinction between renters and owners matters, because you don't have that if you're an owner and you've already paid off your mortgage. You could go and sell that house, and you want to move to the other side of the city, and you could probably buy another house on the other end of the city for the same amount of money and net out. So the lived experience is just going to be so much different between those groups.
I remember when I had a one-bedroom apartment and I was thinking that I was hoping to have a kid, and I thought, oh my gosh, I don't know if I can do it in this one-bedroom apartment. I looked at costs of moving into a two-bedroom, and it was like double at the time. Then the pandemic dropped them and ended up moving into a two-bedroom, and my cost still went up like 60 or 70%, which is so huge. And when you add in the idea of having a kid, which has daycare costs associated with it, it's a really, like, you feel trapped almost. It's so hard to imagine, like, how do you make it work? And you do feel like you moved in at a certain time and that's it. Like, you cannot move, especially if you moved in right before rents really started increasing in the last, I'd say, 7 years or so. It's a really tough feeling, and I know so many people have struggled with that.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's how we should look at these issues, and I think this is how we should look at the problem of the missing middle. Title of the podcast is all around choice, right? That in my mind, what success looks like for a middle class person, or what we should be aspiring to have our middle class be able to do, is have those choices, right? That they don't feel locked in to certain situations where they go, okay, I could never leave my apartment because if I do, any place I move to would be too expensive, or I can't afford to take that job in Oakville because I can't afford to live anywhere in commuting distance. So when we start to think about things that way, and this is not a very economist way of doing things, like every bone in my training goes, okay, no, let's get a quantitative metric of income or wealth. But I say no, it's harder than that. That I think if we're trying to look at the vibrancy of the middle class, I think we have to look at this in terms of choice. That if you are a 28-year-old either individual or couple earning middle class income, what does your choice set look like? What are your options? And I think we need to find ways to broaden that option set. And I will say, as somebody who was in that boat 20 years ago, back when I was in 26, I think that option set was larger for me than it would be today if I were 26 and
For sure.
having the same kind of income. And I think that's how we have to look at the problem. And I think these things where we hear from the avocado toast boomers, I think they miss that point, that you can look at income, you can look at wealth, but things have gotten worse for people, not because of that income or wealth or what have you, but just that their option set is smaller than it would have been 20 years ago in a similar circumstance.
We know that the proportion of society in Canada that is renting, it's gone up. Is that a bad thing?
Well, it comes to that question of choice. So if it's based on the fact that people have just decided that they don't want to be involved in home ownership, and there's a lot of good reasons not to want to deal with home ownership. You might go, well, if you own a home, and again, I'll use myself as a homeowner. So I own a home in Ottawa, and it's my wife and I, and it is the by far the most valuable asset that I own. I am making a really large bet on the future of Ottawa real estate by owning this home. So a lot of people go, you know what? I'm not happy having a portfolio that's that undiversified, right? I don't really want to make a big, pour all of my life savings into the value of real estate in Woodstock, Ontario, or wherever you happen to live. I want to have a more diversified portfolio, and how I get there is renting. Or I just want to have more flexibility so I can pick up overnight and move and take a job in Vancouver. If that's the type of decisions that people are making, that's fantastic, right? That if people are going into renting because that's where they want to be. But I think for too many folks that they're renters because there's no choice, right? Because they've been basically locked out of the home ownership market. And I think that's a huge problem. So, that proportion of renters by itself, I don't think you can really tell whether a high number is good or bad. It's what is the underlying cause causing that number to rise or fall. That's what we have to look at.
When you have those different buckets, we have the couple different kinds of owners. I'd say a couple different kinds of renters, depending on when they moved in and whether their unit is rent controlled today. But does that cover all the people we can talk about in the middle class?
Well, there's other groups that we're missing. So no, this three bucket doesn't cover all adults. So there are some that are missing. That, for instance, people in long term care homes aren't really renters or owners in their traditional sense. They're off doing something else, or supportive living and things like that. But there's one really big group that we're not talking about in this discussion, and it's because we're looking at things in a family based, not an individual based way. And the individuals that we're missing here are adult children living with their parents. So, a little kind of history lesson. Back in 2001, which was not that long ago, about 30% of 20 to 34-year-olds in Canada lived with a parent, and about 50% lived with a spouse, a partner, kid, a child, or some combination of those things. And the remaining either lived alone, lived with a roommate, that kind of thing. Fast forward just 20 years later, just 2 decades later, and the percentage of adults living with a parent has risen. The percentage of adults between the ages of 20 and 34 has risen, went from 30% to 35%. And the proportion living with a spouse, partner, or child is down to 39%. So these things are basically converging here. We've had this kind of slow moving glacial change in Canada, where a 27-year-old, let's say, 20 years ago would be far more likely to be married, to have kids, to be on their own than live with a parent. And now it's kind of 50-50, that you have more of them living with a parent and fewer of them married or living with a partner or living with a child. And this trend doesn't seem to be slowing down, that every year the proportion living with their parents goes up, and the proportion, again, being married, having a partner, having kids, is declining.
Do we know if there's an increase in people wanting to do that, or is this just a housing crisis story?
Well, that's the challenge here, right? And it again goes back to that sort of ownership market. Are people being pulled into that lifestyle because they want to be, or are they getting pushed into it due to economic necessity? And I do think there's some of both going on. So some of this may be just overall changes in culture. Like people are less interested in getting married, less interested in doing certain things, and more. It might be seen as more socially acceptable to live with parents. Some of it actually might be due to cultural changes, due to higher levels of immigration. That, depending on country, it's more likely for people to move out at a later age in some cultures than other cultures. So there are a bunch of things going on, but we know it's economic, and we know it's economic because of correlations, that the places in Canada where home prices have gone up the fastest are the places where the proportion of adult individuals living with their parents has also gone up the fastest. And those places tend to be in southern Ontario. And it's not just the GTA. One of the biggest ones is Windsor. We're seeing big increases in the Windsor area in both real estate prices and 20 to 34-year-olds living with their parents. So there's a tight correlation there. And I'll suggest that it's high housing prices that are causing people to live with their parents, and not people living with their parents that is causing high housing prices.
I know that conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has talked about that. He's talked about the idea of the kids living in their parents' basements. I hear him use that line over and over. The 30-year-old living in his mom's basement. Do you think that any of the parties are doing anything or proposing anything that can actually help with that? Is it just a matter of housing supply, or is there a way to target help to those people?
Well, I think there's a few things, and I think over the last 20 years, we've seen governments really try to have all kinds of incentive plans and savings plans to first-time home buyers to try and help on the demand side there. I think a lot of the solutions are more on the supply side of being able to create housing, particularly housing that is affordable to first time home buyers. But I think Polyev here has tapped into something that's real and that's happening, and discuss it in a way that I haven't seen from any other politicians. Like it feels like he's really taken a look at this data, and said, okay, yeah, there's something real here, that people are being pushed into living with their parents longer by economic circumstances. And I wouldn't suggest necessarily that his solution set solves the problem, but I think he's described the problem and diagnosed the problem better than almost any politician I've seen in Canada.
If there's no one definition of middle class that really covers this, or even talking about the different kinds of owners, different kinds of renters, you can't target a policy towards that whole group. How does a government kind of communicate that to the public?
Well, it is. I mean, it is a challenge, and it's one of the things that makes public policy difficult is a lot of these policies that you could do, affect the entire real estate market. So, for instance, building more student residences is one of actually the best things you could do to help first time home buyers. Why? Well, you have more students living in residences. That takes pressure off of the real estate market and makes it less attractive for investors to buy up single family homes and turn them into student rentals. But communicating that kind of chain of logic can be quite difficult. I mean, there's a maxim in politics that if you're explaining, you're losing. So it is a challenge. I'm a policy wonk, and you should never ask a policy wonk to do political communications. But as a policy wonk, I can at least recognize the difficulty here, that because housing is a system, because all of these things are interlinked with each other, um, that the sort of optimal policy is not really obvious to people how it would work and how it would make their lives better off.
Thanks so much for watching and listening.
Please like or subscribe or leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you.
And thanks as always to our producer, Meredith Martin. We'll see you next time.